The Voice of the Beach by Ramsey Campbell. From the book Poe's Children, all the stories written in the vein and spirit of Edgar Allan Poe. I met Neil at the station. Of course, I can describe it. I have only to go up the road and look, but there's no need. That isn't what I have to get out of me. It isn't me. It's out there. It can be described. I need all of my energy for that, all my concentration, but perhaps it will help if I can remember before that, when everything looked manageable, expressible, familiar enough, when I could bear to look out of the window. Neil was standing alone on the small platform, and now I see that I dare not go up the road after all, or out of the house. It doesn't matter, my memories are clear, they will help me hold on. Neil must have rebuffed the station master, who was happy to chat to anyone. He was gazing at the bare tracks sharpened by June light as they cut their way through the forest, gazing at them as a suicide might gaze at a razor. He saw me, he swept his hair back from his face over his shoulders. Suffering had pared his face down, stretched the skin tighter and paler over the skull. I can remember exactly how he looked before. "I thought I'd missed the station," he said to me, though surely the station's name was visible enough, despite the flowers that scaled the board. If only he had. "I had to make so many changes. Never mind. Christ, it's good to see you. You look marvelous. I expect you can thank the sea for that." His eyes had brightened, and he sounded so full of life that it was spilling out of him in a tumble of words, but his handshake felt like cold bone. I heard him along the road that led home, and he was beginning to screw up his eyes at the sunlight, and I thought I should get him inside. Presumably headaches were among his symptoms. At first the road is gravel, fragments of which always succeed in working their way into your shoes. Where the trees fade out as though stifled by sand, a concrete path turns aside. Sand sifts over the gravel. You can hear the gritty conflict underfoot and the musing of the sea. Beyond the path stands this crescent of bungalows. Surely all this is still true. But I remember now that the bungalows looked unreal against the burning blue sky and the dunes like embryo hills. They looked like a dream set down in the piercing light of June. "You must be doing well to afford all this." Neil sounded listless, envious only because he felt it was expected. If only he had stayed that way. But once inside the bungalow, he seemed pleased by everything. The view, my books on show in the living room bookcase, my typewriter displaying a token page that bore a token phrase, the Bruegel prints that used to remind me of humanity. Abruptly, with a moody eagerness that I hardly remarked at the time, he said, "Shall we have a look at the beach?" There, I've written the word. I can describe the beach. I must describe it. It is all that's in my head. I have my notebook, which I took with me that day. Neil led the way along the gravel path beyond the concrete turn-off the bungalows. The gravel was engulfed almost at once by sand, despite the thick ranks of low bushes that had been planted to keep back the sand. We squeezed between the bushes, he and I, which were determined to close their ranks across the gravel. Once through, we felt the breeze, whose waves passed through the marram grass that spiked the dunes. Neil's hair streamed back, pale as grass. The trudged dunes were slowing him down, eager as he was. We slithered down to the beach, and the sound of the unfurling sea and Ginger approaching leapt closer, as though we'd awakened it from dreaming. The wind fluttered, trapped in my ears, leafed through my notebook as I scribbled the image of awakening and thought with an appalling innocence. Perhaps I can use that image. Now we are walled off from the rest of the world by these dunes. Faceless mounds with unkempt green wigs, mounds almost as white as the sun. Even then I felt that the beach was somehow separate from its surroundings. Introverted, I remember thinking. I put it down to the shifting haze which hovered above the sea, the haze which I could never focus, whose distance I could never quite judge. From the self-contained stage of the beach, the bungalows look absurdly intrusive, anachronisms, rejected by the geomorphological time of sand and sea. Even the skeletal car and the other debris, half engulfed by the beach near the coast road, looked less alien. These are my memories, the most stable things left to me, and I must go on. I found today that I cannot go back any further. Neil was staring, eyes narrowed against the glare along the waste of beach that stretched in the opposite direction from the coast road and curved out of sight. Doesn't anyone come down here? There's no pollution, is there? Well, it depends on who you believe. Often the beach seemed to give me a headache, even when there was no glare, and then there was the way the beach looked at night. Still, I think most folks go up to the coastal resorts. That's the only reason I can think of. We were walking. Beside us, the edge of the glittering sea moved in several directions simultaneously. Moist sand, sleek as satin, displayed shells which appeared to flash patterns faster than my mind could grasp. Pinpoint mirrors of sand gleamed, rapid as Morse. My notes say that this is how it seemed. Don't your neighbors ever come down? Neil's voice made me start. I'd been engrossed in the designs of shell and sand. Momentarily, I was unable to judge the width of the beach. A few paces or miles. I grasped my sense of perspective, but a headache was starting, a dull, impalpable grip that encircled my cranium. Now I know what all this meant, but I want to remember how I felt before I knew. Very seldom, I said. Some of them think there's quicksand. One old lady sitting in her garden to glare at the dunes like conute versus sand had told me that warning notices kept sinking. I'd never encountered quicksand. I always brought my stick to help me trudge, though. So I'll have the beach to myself. Well, I took that to be a hint. At least he would leave me alone if I wanted to work. The bungalow people are mostly retired, I said. Those who aren't in wheelchairs go driving. I imagine they've had enough of the sand, even if they aren't past walking on it. Once, further up this beach, I'd encountered nudists censoring themselves with towels or straw hats as they ventured down to the sea. But Neil could find out about them for himself. I wondered now if I ever really saw them at all, or simply felt that I should. Was he listening to me? His head cocked, but not toward me. He slowed and was staring at the ridges and furrows of the beach at which the sea was lapping. All at once the ridges reminded me of convolutions in the brain. I took out my notebook as the grip on my skull tightened. The beach was as a subconscious, my notes say. The horizon is imagination. Sunlight set a ship ablaze on the edge of the world, an image that impressed me as vividly yet indefinably symbolic. The debris as memories, half buried, half comprehensible. But then, what were those bungalows, perched above the dunes like boxes carved of dazzling bone? I glanced up. A cloud had leaned toward me. No, it had been more as though the cloud were rushing at the beach from the horizon, dauntingly fast. Had it been a cloud, it had seemed more massive than a ship. The sky was empty now, and I told myself that it had been an effect of the haze, the magnified shadow of a gull, perhaps. My start had enlivened Neil, who began to chatter like a television wakened by a kick. It'll be good for me to be alone here, to get used to being alone. Mary and the children found themselves another home, you see. He earns more money than I'll ever see. If that's what they want, he's the head of the house type. If that's what they want. I couldn't be that way now if I tried, said Neil. Not with the way my nerves are now. I can still hear everything he said, and I suppose that I knew what had been wrong with Neil. Now they are just words. That's why I'm talking so much, Neil said. He picked up a spiral shell. I thought to quiet himself. That's much too small, my friend. You'll never hear anything in that. Minutes passed before Neil took it away from his ear and handed it to me. No, he said. I put the shell to my ear, and I wasn't sure what I was hearing. No, I didn't throw the shell away. I didn't crush it underfoot. In any case, how could I have done that to the rest of the beach? I was straining to hear, straining to make out how the sound differed from the usual whisper of a shell. Was that it seemed to have a rhythm that I couldn't define, or that it sounded shrunken by distance rather than cramped by the shell? I felt expectant, entranced, precisely the feeling I tried so often to communicate in my fiction, I believe. Something stooped toward me from the horizon. I jerked and I dropped the shell. There was nothing but the dazzle of sunlight that leapt at me from the waves. The haze above the sea had darkened, straining the light, and I told myself that was what I'd seen. But when Neil picked up another shell, I felt uneasy. The grip on my skull was very tight now as I regarded the vistas of empty sea and sky and beach, and my expectancy grew oppressive, too imminent, no longer enjoyable. I think I'll head back now, I said. Maybe you should go as well. I rummaged for an uncontrived reason, just in case there's quicksand. All right, It's in all of them, he said, displaying an even smaller shell to me, which he just listened. I remember thinking that his observation was so self-evident as to be meaningless. As I turned toward the bungalows, the glitter of the sea clung to my eyes. After images crowded among the debris, they were moving. I strained to make out their shape. What did they resemble? Symbols? Hieroglyphs? Limbs writhing rapidly as if in a ritual dance? They made the debris appear to shift, to crumble. The herd of faceless dunes seemed to edge forward. An image leaned toward me out of the sky. Now I closed my eyes to calm their antics, and I wondered if I should take the warnings of pollution more seriously. We walked toward the confusion of footprints that climbed the dunes. Neil glanced about at the sparkling of the sand. Never before had the beach so impressed me as a complex of patterns, and perhaps that means it was already too late. Spotlighted by the sun, it looked so artificial that I came close to doubting how it felt underfoot. The bungalows looked unconvincing now, too. Still, when we'd slumped in our chairs for a while, and letting the relative dimness soothe our eyes while our bodies guzzled every hint of coolness, I forgot about the beach. I forgot about the nudists. I forgot all. We shared 2 liters of wine and talked about my work, about his lack of any since graduating. Later, I prepared melons, salads, water ice. Neil watched, obviously embarrassed that he couldn't help. He seemed lost without Mary. One more reason not to marry, I thought, congratulating myself. As we ate, he kept staring at the beach. A ship was caught in the amber sunset, a dream of escape. I felt the image less deeply than I'd experienced the metaphors of the beach. It was less oppressive. The band around my head had faded. When it grew dark, Neil pressed close to the pane. "What's that?" he demanded. I switched out the light so that he could see. Beyond the dim humps of the dunes, the beach was glowing a dull pallor like moonlight stifled by fog. Do all beaches glow at night? "That's what makes the people say there's pollution," I said to him. "Not the light," he said impatiently. "The other things. What's moving down there?" Moving. I squinted through the pane. For minutes I could see nothing but the muffled glow. At last, when my eyes were smarting, I began to see forms, thin and stiff as scarecrows, jerky into various contorted poses. Gazing for so long was bound to produce something of the kind, after all, and I took them to be after-image of the tangle, barely visible, of bushes. "I think I'll go and see." "I shouldn't go down there at night," I said, having realized that I'd never gone to the beach at night, and felt a definite, though irrational, aversion to doing so. Eventually, Neil went to bed. Despite all his traveling, he needed to drink himself a sleepy. I heard him open his bedroom window, which overlooked the beach. There's so much still to write, isn't there? So much to struggle through. And what good can it do me now? I had taken the bungalow, one of the few entries in my diary says, to give myself the chance to write without being distracted by city life, the cries of the telephone, the tolling of the doorbell, the omnipresent clamor, only to discover, once I'd left it behind, that city life was my theme. But I was a compulsive writer. If I failed to write for more than a few days, I became depressed. Writing was the way I overcame the depression of not writing. Now writing seems to be my only way of hanging on to what remains of myself, of delaying the end. The day after Neil arrived, I typed a few lines of a sample chapter. It wasn't a technique I enjoyed, tearing a chapter out of context of a novel that didn't yet exist. In any case, I was distracted by the beach, compelled to scribble my notes about it, trying to define the images it suggested. I hoped these notes might build into a story. I was picking at the notes in search of the story when Neil said, "Hey, maybe I could lose myself for a bit in the countryside, huh?" I said curtly, not looking up. "Didn't you say there was a deserted village up the way?" By the time I directed Neil, I would have lost the thread of my thoughts. The thread had been frayed and tangled anyway. As long as I was compelled to think about the beach, I might just as well be down there. I can still write as if I don't know the end. It helps me not to think of. "I'll come with you," I said. The weather was nervous. Archipelagos of cloud floated low on the hazy horizon above the sea. Great Rorschach blots rose from behind the slate hills like dissolved stone. As we squeezed through the bushes, a shadow came hunching over the dunes to meet us. When my foot touched the beach, a moist, shadowy chill seized me, as though the sand disguised a lurking marsh. Then sunlight spilled over the beach, which leapt into clarity. I strode, though Neil appeared to want to dawdle. I wasn't anxious to linger. After all, I told myself it might rain. Glinting mosaics of grains of sand changed restlessly around me, never quite achieving a pattern. Patches of sand, flat, shapeless, elongated ghosts glided over the beach and faltered, waiting for another breeze. Neil kept peering at them as though to make out their shapes. Half a mile along the beach, the dunes began to sag, to level out. The slate hills were closing in. Were they the source of the insidious chill now? Perhaps I was feeling the damp. A penumbra of moisture welled up around each of my footprints. The large, wet shapes seemed quite unrelated to my prints, an effect which I found unnerving. When I glanced back, it was as though something enormous was imitating my walk. The humidity was almost suffocating. My head felt clamped by tension. Wind blundered, booming in my ears. Even when I could feel no breeze, its jerky rhythm was distracting because indefinable. Gray cloud had flooded the sky, together with the hills and the thickening haze above the sea. It caged the beach. At the edge of my eye, the convolutions of the beach seemed to writhe, to struggle to form patterns. The insistent sparkling nagged at my mind. I'd begun to wonder whether I had been blaming imagined pollution for the effects of heat and humidity. I was debating whether to turn back before I grew dizzy or nauseous when Neil said, "Is that it?" I peered ahead, trying to squint the dazzle of waves from my eyes. A quarter of a mile away, the hills ousted the dunes completely. Beneath the spiky slate, a few uprights of rock protruded from the beach like standing stones. They glowed sullenly as copper through the haze. They were encrusted with sand. Surely that wasn't the village. "Yeah, that's it," Neil said and strode forward. I followed him, because the village must be further on. The veil of haze drew back, the vertical rocks gleamed unobscured, and I halted bewildered. The rocks were not encrusted at all. They were slate, gray as the table of rock on which they stood above the beach. Though the slate was jagged, some of its gaps were irregular windows, doorways. Here and there, walls still formed corners. How could the haze have distorted my view so spectacularly? Neil was climbing rough steps carved out of the slate table. Without warning, as I stood confused by my misperception, I felt utterly alone. A bowl of dull haze trapped me on the bare sand. Slate, or something more massive and vague, loomed over me. The kaleidoscope of shells was about to shift. The beach was ready to squirm, to reveal its pattern, shake off its artificiality. The massive looming would reach down. My start felt like a convulsive awakening. The table was deserted except for the fragments of buildings. I could hear only the wind now, baying as though its mouth was vast and uncontrollable. "Neil!" I called. Dismayed by the smallness of my voice, I shouted, "Neil!" I heard what sounded like scales of armor, chafing together. Slate, of course. The gray walls shone lifelessly, cavitied as skulls, gaping windows displayed an absence of faces, of rooms. Then Neil's head poked out of a half wall. "Yes, come on! It's strange," he said to me. As I climbed the steps and sand gritted underfoot like sugar, low drifts of sand were piled against the walls. Patches glinted on the small plateau. Could that sand have made the whole place look encrusted and half buried? I told myself that it had been just an effect of the heat. Broken walls surrounded me. They glared like storm clouds and lightning. They formed a maze whose center was desertion. That image stirred another, too deep in my mind to be definable. The place was not a maze, but a puzzle whose solution would clarify the pattern, a larger mystery. I realized that then, why couldn't I have fled? I suppose I was held by the enigma of the village. I knew there were quarries in the hills above, but I'd never learned why the village had been abandoned. Perhaps its meagerness had killed it. I saw traces of less than a dozen buildings here. It seemed further dwarfed by the beach. The sole visible trace of humanity. It dwindled beneath the gnawing of the sand and the elements. I found it enervating, its lifelessness ineffectuous. Should I stay with Neil or risk leaving him there? And before I could decide, I heard him say amid a rattle of slate, "This is interesting." Interesting? In what way? He was clambering about an exposed cellar among shards of slate. Whatever the building had been, it had stood furthest from the sea. "I don't mean the cellar," Neil said. "I mean that." Reluctantly, I peered where Neil was pointing. In the cellar wall, furthest from the beach, a rough alcove had been chipped out of the slate. It was perhaps a yard deep, but barely high enough to accommodate a huddled man. Neil was already crawling in. I heard slate crack beneath him. His feet protruded from the darkness. Of course, they weren't about to jerk convulsively, but my nervousness made me back away when its muffled voice said, "Oh, what's this?" Neil backed out like a terrier with his prize. It was an old notebook, its pages stuck together in a moist wad. "Someone covered it up with slate," he said, as though that should tempt my interest. Before I could prevent him, he was sitting on the edge of the beach and peeling the pages gingerly apart. Not that I was worried that he might be destroying a fragment of history. I simply wasn't sure that I wanted to read whatever had been hidden in the cellar. Why couldn't I have followed my instincts? Neil disengaged the first page carefully, then frowned. "Oh, this begins in the middle of something. Well, there must be another book." Handing me the notebook then, he stalked away to scrabble again in the cellar. I sat on the edge of the slate table and I glanced at the page. It's before me now, on my desk. The pages have crumbled since then. The yellowing paper looks more and more like sand. But the large writing is still legible, unsteady capitals in a hand that might once have been literate before it grew senile. No punctuation separates the words, though blotches sometimes do. Beneath the relentless light of the deserted village, the faded ink looked unreal, scarcely present at all. From the beach, everyone gone now, but me. It's not so bad in daytime, except I can't go, but at night I can hear it reaching for... A blot of fungus had consumed a word here. And the voice is... its voice. And the glowing, at least, it helps me see down here when it comes. I left it at that. My suddenly unsteady fingers might have torn the page. I wished to God they had. I was on the edge with the struggle between humidity and the chill of slate and beach. I felt feverish. As I stared at the words, they touched the impressions, half memories. If I looked up, would the beach have changed? I heard Neil slithering on the slate, turning over fragments. In my experience, stones were best not turned over. Eventually he returned. I was dully fascinated by the shimmering of the beach. My fingers pinched the notebook shut. "I can't find anything. I'll have to come back." He took the notebook from me and began to read, muttering, "What the—" Gently he separated the next page from the wad. "This gets even stranger," he murmured. What the hell kind of guy was this? Imagine what it must have been like to live inside his head. How did he know it had been a man? I stared at the pages to prevent Neil from reading them aloud. At least it saved me from having to watch the antics of the beach, which moved like slow flames, but the introverted meandering of the words had made me nervous. "It can't reach down here. Not yet, but outside is changing. Outside, part of the pattern. I read the pattern. That's why I can't go solve them dancing the pattern. It wants me to dance. It's a lie, but it's the only image being put together." Neil was wide-eyed, fascinated. Feverish disorientation gripped my skull. I felt too unwell to move. The heat haze must be closing in. At the edge of my vision, everything was shifting. "When the pattern's done, it can't come back and grow. It's hungry to be everything. I know how it works. The sand moves at night and sucks you down and makes you go where it wants to make..." A blotch had eaten several words here. "When they built Lewis, there was the old stones that they moved. Maybe the stones kept it small. Now it's the beach at least." On the next page, the letters are much larger and wavery. Had the light begun to fail, or had the writer been retreating from the light, from the entrance to the cellar? I didn't know which alternative I disliked more. "Got to write, hands shaky from chipping tunnel, no food, they're singing now, helping it reach, chanting with no mouse, they sing and dance the pattern for it to reach through." Now there are very few words to each page. The letters are jagged as though the writer's hand kept twitching violently. "Glow, coming, it's out there. Now it's looking in at me. I can't hold. If I keep writing, they want me to dance, so it'll grow, want me to be..." There it ends. "Ah, the influence of Joyce," I commented sourly. The remaining pages are blank except for fungus. I managed to stand up. My head felt like a balloon pumped full of gas. "I'd like to go back now. I think of a touch of sunstroke." 100 yards away, I glanced back at the remnants of the village. Lewis, I assumed it had been called. The stone remains wavered as though striving to achieve a new shape. The haze made them look coppery, fat with a crust of sand. I was desperate to get out of the heat. Closer to the sea, I felt slightly oppressed. But the whispering of sand, the liquid murmur of the waves, the bumbling of the wind all chanted together insistently. Everywhere on the beach were patterns, demanding to be read. Neil clutched the notebook under his arm. "What do you make of it?" he said eagerly. His indifference to my health annoyed me, and hence so did the question. "He was mad," I said. "Living here, is it any wonder? Maybe he moved them there after the place was abandoned. The beach must glow there, too. That must have finished him off. You saw how he tried to dig himself a refuge. That's all there is to it." "Do you think so? I wonder," Neil said. He picked up a shell. "Welcome, fellow raven." As he held the shell to his ear, his expression became so withdrawn and unreadable that I felt a pang of dismay. Was I seeing a symptom of his nervous trouble? He stood like a fragment of the village, as though the shell had been holding him rather than the reverse. Eventually he mumbled, That's it. That's what he meant. Chanting with no mouths. I took the shell only very reluctantly. My head was pounding now. I pressed the shell to my ear, though I was deafened by the storm of my own blood. If the shell was muttering, I couldn't bear the jaggedness of its rhythm. I seemed less to hear it than to feel it deep in my skull. Nothing like it, I said, almost snarling, and thrust the shell at him. Now that I had to strain to hear it, I couldn't rid myself of that muttering. It seemed to underlie the winds of the sea. I trudged onward, eyes half shut. Moisture sprang up around my feet. The glistening shapes around my prints looked larger and more definite. I had to cling to my sense of my own size and shape. When we neared home, I couldn't see the bungalows. There appeared to be only the beach, growing huge and blinding now. At last, Neil heard a car leaving the crescent and led me up the path of collapsed footprints. In the bungalow, I lay willing the lights and patterns to fade from my closed eyes. Neil's presence didn't soothe me, even though he was only poring over the notebook. He'd brought a handful of shells indoors. Occasionally, he held one to his ear, muttering, It's still there, you know. It does sound like chanting, you know. At least, I thought peevishly. I knew when something was a symptom of illness, but the trouble was that in my delirium, I was tempted to agree with Neil. I felt I had almost heard what the sound was trying to be. Next day, Neil returned to the deserted village. He was gone for so long that even amid the clamor of my disordered senses, I grew anxious. I couldn't watch for him. Whenever I tried, the white, hot beach began to judder, to quake, and set me shivering. At last he returned. Having failed to find another notebook, I hoped that would be the end of it. But his failure had simply frustrated him. His irritability chafed against mine. He managed to prepare a bedraggled salad, of which I ate little. As the tide of twilight rolled in from the horizon, he sat by the window, gazing alternately at the beach and at the notebook. Without warning, he said, I'm going for a stroll. Can I borrow your stick? I guessed that he meant to go to the beach. Should he be trapped by darkness and sea, I was in no condition to go to his aid. I'd rather you didn't. Don't worry, I won't lose it. My lassitude suffocated my arguments. I lolled in my chair, and through the open window I heard him padding away, his footsteps muffled by sand. Soon there was only the vague, slack rumble of the sea, blundering back and forth, and the faint hiss of sand in the bushes. After half an hour I made myself stand up, though the ache in my head surged and gazed out at the whitish beach. The whole expanse appeared to flicker like hints of lightning. I strained my ears. The beach looked crowded with debris, all of which danced to the flickering. I had to peer at every movement, but there was no sign of Neil. I went out and I stood between the bushes. The closer I approached the beach, the more crowded with obscure activity it seemed. But I suspected that much, if not all, of this could be blamed on my own condition, for within 5 minutes my head felt so tight and unbalanced that I had to retreat indoors away from the heat. Though I'd meant to stay awake, I was dozing when Neil returned. I woke to find him gazing from the window. As I opened my eyes, the beach lurched forward, shining. It didn't look crowded now, presumably because my eyes had had a rest. What could Neil see to preoccupy him so? Enjoy your stroll, I said sleepily. Neil turned. I felt a twinge of disquiet. His face looked stiff with doubt. His eyes were uneasy. A frown dug its roots in his forehead. It doesn't glow, he said. Assuming I knew what he was talking about, I could only wonder how badly his nerves were affecting his perceptions. If anything, the beach looked even brighter. How do you mean? The beach, down by the village. It doesn't glow. Not anymore. Oh, I see. He looked offended, almost contemptuous, though I couldn't understand why he'd expected me to be less indifferent. He withdrew into a scrutiny of the notebook now. He might have been trying to solve an urgent problem. Perhaps if I hadn't been ill, I would have been able to divert Neil from his obsession, but I could hardly venture outside without growing dizzy. I could only wait in the bungalow for my state to improve. Neither Neil nor I had had the sunstroke before, but he seemed to know how to treat it. Keep drinking water. Cover yourself if you start shivering. He didn't mind my staying in. He seemed almost too eager to go out alone. Did that matter? Next day he was bound only for the library. My state was crippling my thoughts. Even if I had been healthy, I could not have imagined how he would look when he returned. Excited, conspiratorial, smug. "I've got a story for you," he said at once. Most such offers prove to be prolonged and dull. "Oh, yes?" I said wearily. He sat forward as though to infect me with suspense. "That village we went to, it isn't called Lewis, it's called Strand." Was he pausing to give me a chance to gasp or applaud? "Oh, yes," I said without enthusiasm. "Lewis was another village, it turns out, further up the coast. It's deserted, too." That seemed to be his punchline. The antics of patterns within my eyelids had made me irritable. "Doesn't seem much of a story," I complained. "Yes, well, that's only the beginning," Neil continued. When his pause had forced me to open my eyes, he said, "I read a book about your local unexplained mysteries." "Why?" "Look, if you don't want to hear it..." "No, go on. Now you've started after all." Not to know might be even more nerve-wracking. "Well, there wasn't much about Lewis," Neil said eventually, perhaps to give himself more time to improvise. "Was there much at all?" "Oh, yes, certainly. It may not sound like much. Nobody knows why Lewis was abandoned, but then nobody knows that about Strand either." My impatience must have showed, for he added hastily, "What I mean is, the people who left Strand wouldn't say why." "Someone asked them?" "The woman who wrote the book. She managed to track some of them down. They'd moved as far inland as they possibly could. That was the one thing that she noticed. And they always had some kind of nervous disorder. Talking about Strand always made them more nervous, as though they felt that talking might make something happen, or something might hear." "That's what the author said?" "Right." "What was her name?" Could he hear my suspicion? "Jesus Christ, I don't know what her name was. What does it matter?" In fact, it didn't. Not to me. His story had made me feel worse. The noose had tightened around my skull. The twilight beach was swarming and vibrating. I closed my eyes. "Shut up!" I roared at him. "Go away!" "There was one thing," he persisted. "One man said the kids kept going on the beach at night. The parents tried all the ways to stop them. Some of them questioned their kids. It was as though the kids couldn't stop themselves. Why was that, do you think?" When I refused to answer, he said irrelevantly, "All this was in the 1930s, you know." I couldn't stand hearing the children called kids. The recurring word had made me squirm. Drips of slang like water torture, and I'd never heard such a feeble punchline. His clumsiness as a storyteller enraged me. He couldn't even organize his material. I was sure he had not read any such book. After a while, I peered out from beneath my eyelids, hoping he decided I was asleep. He was poring over the notebook again and looked rapt this time. I only wished that people and reviewers would read my books as carefully. He kept rubbing his forehead as though to enliven his brain. I dozed. When I opened my eyes, he was waiting for me. He shoved the notebook at me to demonstrate something. "Look, I'm sorry," I said without much effort to sound so. "I'm really not in the mood." Neil stalked into his room, emerging without the book, with my stick. "I'm going for a walk," he announced sulkily, like a spouse after a quarrel. I dozed gratefully, for I felt more delirious. My head felt packed with grains of sand that gritted together. In fact, the whole of me was made of sand now. Of course, it was true that I was composed of particles, and I thought my delirium had found a metaphor for that, but the grains that floated through my inner vision were neither sand nor atoms. A member, dark and vague, was reaching for them. I struggled to awaken. I didn't want to distinguish shape, and still less did I want to learn what it meant to do with the grains, for as the members sucked them into itself, engulfing them in a way that I refused to perceive, I saw that the grains were worlds and stars. I woke, shivering. My body felt uncontrollable and unfamiliar. I let it shake itself to rest. Not that I had a choice, but I was concentrating on the problem of why. I'd woken, my head raised like a watchdog. What had I heard? Perhaps only wind and sea. Both seemed louder, more intense. My thoughts became entangled in their rhythms. I felt there had been another sound. The bushes threshed, sounding parched with sand. Had I heard Neil returning? I stumbled into his room. It was empty. As I stood by Neil's open window, straining my ears, I thought I heard his voice blurred by the dull tumult of waves. I peered out. Beyond the low heads of the beaches, the glow of the beach shuddered toward me. I had to close my eyes, for I couldn't tell whether the restless, scrawny shapes were crowding my eyeballs or the beach. It felt somehow like both. When I looked again, I seemed to see Neil. Or was it Neil? The unsteady stifle glow aggravated the distortions of my vision. Was the object just a new piece of debris? I found its shape bewildering, like my mind kept apprehending it as a symbol printed on the whitish expanse. The luminosity made it seem to shift tentatively and jerkily, as though it was learning to pose. The light, or my eyes, surrounded it with dancing. Had my sense of perspective left me? I was misjudging size, either of the beach or of the figure. Yes, it was a figure. However large it seemed, it was moving its arms like a puppet. It was half buried in the sand. I staggered outside, shouting to Neil, and then I recoiled. The sky must be thick with a storm cloud. It felt suffocatingly massive, solid as a rock, and close enough to crush me. I forced myself toward the bushes, though my head was pounding, squeezed into a lump of pain. Almost at once, I heard the plodding on the dunes. My blood half deafened me. The footsteps sounded vague and immense. I peered along the dim path. At the edge of my vision, the beach flickered repetitively. Immense darkness hovered over me, unnervingly close to me. Swollen by the glow, a head rose into view. For a moment, my tension seemed likely to crack my own skull. And then Neil spoke. His words were incomprehensible amid the wind, but it was his voice. As we trudged back toward the lights, the threat of a storm seemed to withdraw, and I blamed it on my tension. "Of course I'm all right," he muttered irritably. I fell, and that made me shout, that's all." Once we were inside, I saw the evidence of his fall. His trousers were covered with sand up to the knees. Next day, Neil hardly spoke to me at all. He went down early to the beach, and he stayed there. I didn't know if he was obsessed or displaying pique. Perhaps he couldn't bear to be near me. Invalids can find each other unbearable. Often I glimpsed him wandering beyond the dunes. He walked as though in an elaborate maze and scrutinized the beach. Was he searching for the key to the notebook? Was he looking for pollution? By the time he found it, I thought sourly would have infected him. I felt too enervated to intervene. As I watched Neil appear to vanish intermittently, if I looked away, I couldn't locate him again for minutes. The beach blazed like bone and was never still. I couldn't blame the aberrations of my vision solely on heat and haze anymore. When Neil returned late that afternoon, I asked him to phone for a doctor. He looked taken aback, but eventually said, "There's a box by the station, isn't there? One of the neighbors would let you phone." "No, I'll walk down. They're probably all wondering why you've let some long-haired freak squat in your house as it is." Neil went out, rubbing his forehead gingerly. He often did that. That, and his preoccupation with the demented notebook, were additional reasons why I wanted a doctor. I felt Neil needed examining too. By the time he returned, it was dusk. On the horizon, embers soared in the sea. The glow of the beach was already stirring. It seemed to have intensified during the last few days. I told myself I'd grown hypersensitive. "Dr. Lewis, he's coming tomorrow." Neil hesitated and went on. "I think I'll just have a stroll on the beach. You want to come?" "Good God, no! I'm ill. Can't you see that?" "I know that." His impatience was barely controlled. "A stroll might do you good. There isn't any sunlight now. I'll stay in until I've seen the doctor, thank you." He looked disposed to argue with me, but his restlessness overcame him. As he left, his bearing seemed to curse me. Was his illness making him intolerant of mine, or did he feel that I'd rebuffed a gesture of reconciliation? I felt too ill to watch him from the window now. When I looked, I could seldom distinguish or make out which movements were his. He appeared to be walking slowly, poking at the beach with my stick. I wondered if he'd found quicksand. Again, his path made me think of a maze. I dozed. Far longer than I had intended. The doctor now loomed over me, peering into my eyes. He reached down. I began to struggle as best I could. I glimpsed the depths of his eye sockets, empty and dry as interstellar space. I didn't need his treatment. I would be fine if he left me alone. Just let me go. But he had reached deep into me, as though I was a bladder that had burst. I felt myself flood into him. I felt vast emptiness absorb my substance and myself. Dimly I understood that it was nothing like emptiness, that my mind refused to perceive what it was. So alien and frightful was its teeming. It was dawn. The muffled light teemed. The beach glowed fitfully. I gasped. Someone was down on the beach, so huddled that he looked shapeless. He rose, levering himself up with my stick, and began to pace haphazardly. I knew at once that he'd spent the night on the beach. After that, I stayed awake. I couldn't imagine the state of his mind, and I was a little afraid of being asleep when he returned. But when, hours later, he came in to raid the kitchen for a piece of cheese, he seemed hardly to see me. He was muttering repetitively under his breath. His eyes looked dazzled by the beach, sunk in his obsession. When did the doctor say he was coming? Later, he mumbled and hurried down to the beach. I hoped he would stay there until the doctor came. Occasionally I glimpsed him at his intricate pacing. Ripples of heat deformed him. His blurred flesh looked unstable. Whenever I glanced at the beach, it leapt forward, dauntingly vivid. Cracks of light appeared in the sea. Clumps of grass seemed to rise, twitching, as though the dunes were craning to watch Neil. 5 minutes' vigil at the window was as much as I could bear, though the afternoon consumed time. It felt lethargic and enervating as 4 in the morning. There was no sign of any doctor. I kept gazing from the front door. Nothing moved on that crescent except wind-borne hints of the beach. Eventually I tried to phone, though I could feel the heat of the pavement through the soles of my shoes. The day seemed bearable. Only threats of pain plucked at my skull, but nobody was at home. The bungalow stood smugly in the evening light. When I attempted to walk to the phone box, the noose closed on my skull at once. In my hall, I halted, startled. For Neil had thrown open the living room door as I entered the house. He looked flushed and angry. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I'm not a hospital case yet, you know. I was trying to phone the doctor." Unfathomably, he looked relieved. "I'll go down and call him." While he was away, I watched the beach sink into twilight. At the moment, this seemed to be the only time of day I could endure watching, the time at which shapes become obscure, most capable of metamorphosis. Perhaps this had made the antics of the shore acceptable, more apparently natural. Now the beach resembled clouds in front of the moon. It drifted slowly and variously. If I gazed for long, it looked nervous with lightning. The immense bulk of the night edged up from the horizon. I didn't hear Neil return. I must have been fascinated by the view. I turned to find him watching me. Again he looked relieved, because I was still there, perhaps. "He's coming soon," he said. "Tonight, do you mean?" "Yes, tonight. Why not?" I didn't know many doctors would come at night to treat what was, however unpleasant for me, a relatively minor illness. Perhaps attitudes were different here in the country. Neil was heading for the back door, for the beach. "You think you could wait until he comes?" I said, groping for an excuse to detain him, "just in case I feel worse." "Yes, you're right." Neil's gaze was opaque. "I'd better stay with you." We waited. The dark mass closed over beach and bungalows. The nocturnal glow fluttered at the edge of my vision. When I glanced at the beach, the dim shapes were hectic. I seemed to be paying for my earlier fascination, for now the walls of the room looked active with faint patterns. Where was that doctor? Neil seemed impatient too. The only sounds were repetitive ticking of his footsteps and the irregular chant of the sea. He kept staring at me as if he wanted to speak. Occasionally his mouth twitched. He resembled a child, both eager to confess and yet afraid to do so. Though he made me uneasy, I tried looking encouraging, interested in whatever he might have to say. His pacing took him closer and closer to the beach door. "Yes," I nodded. "Tell me. Talk to me." His eyes narrowed. Behind his eyelids he was pondering. Abruptly he sat opposite me. A kind of smile tweaked a wry plucked at his lips. "I've got another story for you," he said. "Really?" I sounded as intrigued as I could. He picked up the notebook. "I worked it out from this." So we'd returned to his obsession. As he twitched pages over, his feet shifted constantly. His lips moved as though whispering the text. I heard the vast mumbling of the sea. "Suppose this," he said all at once. "I only said suppose, mind you. Suppose this guy was living all alone in Strand. It must have affected his mind. You said that yourself, having to watch the beach every night. But just suppose it didn't send him mad. Suppose it affected his mind so that he saw things more clearly." I hid my impatience. "What things?" "The beach." Neil's tone reminded me of something, a particular kind of simplicity I couldn't quite place. "Of course, we're only supposing, but from the things you've read, don't you feel there are places that are closer to another sort of reality, another plane or dimension or whatever?" "You mean the beach at Strand was like that?" I suggested to encourage him. That's right. Did you feel it too?" His eagerness startled me. "I felt ill, that's all. I still do." Sure, yes, of course. I mean, we're only supposing. But look what he says." Neil seemed glad to retreat into the notebook. "It started at Lewis, where the old stones were. Then it moved up on the coast to the Strand. Doesn't that prove that what he was talking about is unlike anything we know?" His mouth hung open, awaiting my agreement. It looked empty, robbed of sense. I glanced away, distracted by the fluttering glow beyond. "I don't know what you mean." That's because you haven't read this properly. Look, up ahead, there's a sign. His impatience had turned harsh. Look here, he demanded, poking his fingers at a group of words as if they were a Bible's oracle. When the pattern's ready, it can't come back. So what is that supposed to mean? I'll tell you what I think it means, what he meant. His low voice seemed to stumble along the rhythms of the beach. You see how he keeps mentioning patterns. Suppose all this other reality was once all there was. Then ours came into being and occupied some of its space. We didn't destroy it. It can't be destroyed. Maybe it withdrew a little to bide its time, but it left a kind of imprint of itself, a kind of coded image of itself in our reality, one we couldn't draw in by adjusting the horizontal or the vertical. And yet that image is itself an embryo, growing. You see how he says it's alive, but it's only the image being put together. Things become part of its image, and that's how it grows. I'm sure that's what he meant. I felt mentally exhausted and dismayed by all this. How much in need of a doctor was he? I couldn't help sounding a little derisive. I don't see how you could have put all that together from that book. Who says I did? His vehemence was shocking. I had to break the tension, for the glare in his eyes looked as unnatural and nervous as the glow of the beach. I went to gaze from the front window, but there was no sign of the doctor. Don't worry, Neil said. He's coming. I stood staring out at the lightless road until he said fretfully, Don't you want to hear the rest? Neil waited until I sat down. His tension was oppressive as the hovering sky. He gazed at me for what seemed minutes. A noose dug into my skull. At last he said, Does this beach feel like anywhere else to you? It feels like a beach. He shrugged that aside. You see, he worked out that whatever came from the old stones kept moving toward the inhabited areas. That's how it added to itself. That's why it moved on from Lewis and then Strand. All nonsense, of course, ravings. No, it isn't. There was no mistaking the fury that lurked, barely restrained beneath his low voice. That fury seemed loose in the roaring night, in the wind and violent sea, in the looming sky. The beach trembled wakefully. The next place it would move to would be here. It has to be. If you accepted the idea in the first place. A hint of a grimace twitched Neil's cheek. My comment might have been an annoying fly, certainly as trivial. You can read the pattern out there if you try, he mumbled. It takes all day. You begin to get a sense of what might be there. It's alive, though nothing like life as we recognize it. I could only say whatever came into my head to detain him until the doctor arrived. Then how do you? He avoided the question, but only to betray the depths of his obsession. Would an insect recognize us as a kind of life? Suddenly I realized that he intoned the beach. As a priest might name his god. We must get away from the beach. Never mind the doctor now. Look, Neil, I think we'd better... He interrupted me, eyes glaring spasmodically. It's strongest at night. I think it soaks up energy during the day. Remember, he said the quicksands only come out at night. They move, you know. They make you follow the pattern, and the sea is different at night. Things come out of it. They're like symbols, yet they're alive. I think the sea creates them. They help make the pattern alive. Appalled, I could only return to the front window and search for the lights of the doctor's car, for any lights at all. Yes, Neil said, sounding less impatient than soothing. He's coming. But as he spoke, I glimpsed, reflected in the window, his secret, triumphant grin. Eventually managed to say to his reflection, You didn't call a doctor, did you? No. A smile made his lips tremble like quicksand. But he's coming. My stomach had begun to churn slowly, so had my head and the room. Now I was afraid to stand with my back to Neil, but when I turned, I was more afraid to ask the question, Who is coming? For a moment, I thought he would disdain to answer. He turned his back on me and gazed toward the beach. But I can't write any longer if I have doubts, as if I don't know the end. The beach was his answer. Its awesome transformation was, even if I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Was the beach swollen, puffed up as if by the irregular gasping of the sea? Was it swarming with its indistinct shapes? Parasites that scuttled dancing over it, sank into it, floated, writhing to its surface. Did it quiver along the whole of its length like luminous gelatin? I tried to believe that all this was an effect of the brooding dark, but the dark had closed down so thickly that there might have been no light in the world outside except that fitful glow. He craned his head back over his shoulder. The gleam in his eyes looked very like the glimmering outside. A web of saliva stretched between his bared teeth. He grinned with a frightful generosity. He decided to answer my question more directly. His lips moved as they had when he was reading. At last I heard what I tried not to suspect. He was making the sound that I tried not to hear in the shells. Was it meant to be an invocation or the name I'd asked for? I knew only that the sound, so liquid and inhuman that I could almost think it was shapeless, nauseated me, so much so that I couldn't separate it from the huge, loose voices of the wind and sea. It seemed to fill the room. The pounding of my skull tried to imitate its rhythm, which I found impossible to grasp, unbearable. I began to sidle along the wall toward the front door. Neil's body turned jerkily as if dangling from his neck. His head laughed, a sound like struggles in mud, his laughter. "I'm not going to get away," he cried. "It was getting hold of you before I came, he was. You haven't a chance now, you know. Not since we brought him into the house." And he picked up a seashell. As he leveled the mouth of the shell at me, my dizziness flooded my skull, hurling me forward. The wall seemed to glare and shake and break out in swarms. I thought that a dark bulk loomed at the window, filling it. Neil's mouth was working, but the nauseating sound might have been roaring deep in a cavern or a shell. It sounded distant and huge, but coming closer and growing more definite. The voice of something was vast and liquid, that it was gradually taking shape. Perhaps that was because I was listening, but I had no choice. All at once, Neil's free hand clamped his forehead. It looked like a pincer desperate to tear something out of his own skull. "It's growing!" he cried, somewhere between sobbing and ecstasy. As he spoke, the liquid chant seemed to abate. Not at all. Before I knew what he meant to do, he'd wrenched open the back door and was gone. In a nightmarish way, his nervous, elaborate movements resembled dancing. As the door crashed open, the roar of the night rushed in. Its leap in volume sounded eager, voracious. I stood paralyzed, listening, and couldn't tell how like his chant it sounded. I heard his footsteps, soft and loose, running unevenly over the dunes. Minutes later, I thought I heard a faint cry, which sounded immediately engulfed. I slumped against a chair. I felt relieved, drained, uncaring. The sounds had returned at the beach where they ought to be. The room looked stable now, and then I grew disgusted with myself. Suppose Neil was injured or caught in quicksand. I'd allowed his hysteria to gain a temporary hold on my sick perceptions, I told myself. Was I going to use that as an excuse not to try to save him? At last I forced myself outside. All the bungalows were dark. The beach was glimmering, but not violently. I could see nothing wrong with the sky. Only my dizziness and the throbbing of my head threatened to distort my perceptions. I made myself edge between the bushes, which hissed like snakes, mouths full of sand. The tangle of footprints made me stumble infrequently. Sand rattled the spikes of marram grass. At the edge of the dunes, the path felt ready to slide me down to the beach. The beach was crowded. I had to squint at many of the vague pieces of debris. My eyes grew used to the dimness, but I could see no sign of Neil. Then I peered closer. Was that a pair of sandals half buried? Before my giddiness could hurl me to the beach, I slithered down. Yes, they were Neil's, and a path of bare footprints led away toward the crowded debris. I poked gingerly at the sandals, and I wished I had a stick to test for quicksand. The sand in which they were partially engulfed was quite solid. Why had he tried to bury them? I followed his prints, my eyes still adjusting. I refused to imitate his path, for it looped back on itself in intricate patterns which made me dizzy and wouldn't fade from my mind. His paces were irregular, a cripple's dance. He must be a puppet of his nerves, I thought. I was a little afraid to confront him, but I felt a duty to try. His twistings led me among the debris. Low, obscure shapes surrounded me. A jagged stump bristling with metal tendrils that groped in the air as I came near. Half a car so rusty and misshapen that it looked like a child's fuzzy sketch. And the hood of a pram within which glimmered a bald lump of sand. And a broken clock that said 8 p.m., but despite that, I continued on my journey. I was glad to emerge from that maze, for the dim objects seemed to shift. I'd even thought the bald lump was opening a crumbling mouth. But on the open beach, there were other distractions. The ripples and patterns of sand were clearer and appeared to vibrate restlessly. I kept glancing toward the sea, not because its chant was troubling me, though with its insistent loose rhythm it was, but because I had a persistent impression that the waves were slowing, sluggish as treacle. I stumbled. I had to turn back to see what had tripped me up. The glow of the beach showed me Neil's shirt, the little of it that was left unburied. There was no mistaking. I recognized his pattern. The glow made the nylon seem luminous, lit from within. His prints danced back among the debris. I knew I would be here Even then, God help me, I wondered if he was playing a sick joke, if he was waiting somewhere to leap out, to scare me into admitting I'd been impressed. I trudged angrily into the midst of the debris, and I wished at once that I hadn't. All the objects were luminous, without shadows. There was no question now the glow of the beach was increasing. It made Neil's tracks look larger. Their outlines shifted as I squinted at them. I stumbled hastily toward the deserted stretch of beach and brushed against the half-engulfed car. That was the moment at which the nightmare became real. I might have told myself that rust had eaten away that car until it was thin as a shell, but I was past deluding myself now. All at once I knew that nothing on this beach was what it seemed, for as my hand collided with the car roof, which should have been painfully solid, I felt the roof crumble and the entire structure flopped on the sand, from whence it was once indistinguishable. I fled toward the open beach, but there was no relief, for the entire beach was glowing luridly like mud struggling to suffocate a moon. Among the debris, I glimpsed the rest of Neil's clothes, half absorbed by the beach. As I staggered into the open, I saw his tracks ahead, saw how they appeared to grow, to alter, until they became unrecognizable, and then to peter out in a large, dark, shapeless patch on the sand. I glared about, terrified. I couldn't see the bungalows. After minutes, I'd succeeded in glimpsing the path, the mess of footprints cluttering the dune. I began to pace toward it, very slowly and quietly, so as not to be noticed by the beach and the looming sky. But the dunes were receding. I think I began to scream then. Scream, almost, in a whisper. For the faster I hurried, the further the dunes withdrew. The nightmare had overtaken perspective. Now I was running wildly, though I felt I was standing still. I'd only run a few steps when I had to recoil from the sand that seized my feet. So eagerly, I almost heard it smack its lips. Minutes ago, there had been no quicksand, for I could see earlier prints embedded in that patch. I stood trapped, shivering uncontrollably, as the glow intensified and the lightless sky seemed to descend, and I felt the beach change. Simultaneously, I experienced something which, in a sense, was worse. I felt myself change. My dizziness whirled out of me. I felt light-headed but stable. At last, I realized that I had never had sunstroke. Perhaps it had been my inner conflict, being forced to stay, yet at the same time not daring to venture onto the beach because of what my subconscious knew would happen. No, kill I. And now it was happening. The beach had won. Perhaps Neil had given it the strength, though I dared not look. I knew that the sea had stopped. Stranded objects, elaborate symbols composed of something like flesh, writhed on its paralyzed margin. The clamor which surrounded me, chanting and gurgling, was not that of the sea. It was far too articulate, however repetitive. It was underfoot, too, the voice of the beach, a whisper pronounced by so many sources that it was deafening. I felt ridges of sand squirm beneath me. They were firm enough to bear my weight, but they felt nothing like sand. They were forcing me to shift my balance. In a moment, I would have to dance to imitate the jerking shapes that had ceased to pretend they were only debris, to join in the ritual of the objects that swarmed up from the congealed sea. Everything glistened in the quivering glow. I thought my flesh had begun to glow too. And then, with a lurch of vertigo worse than I'd ever experienced, I found myself momentarily detached from this nightmare. I seemed to be observing myself. A figure tiny and trivial as an insect, making a timid, hysterical attempt to join in the dance of the teeming beach. The moment was brief, yet felt like eternity. Then I was back in my clumsy flesh, struggling to prance on the beach. At once I was cold with terror. I shook like the victim of electricity, for I knew that viewpoint I'd shared. It was still watching me, indifferent as outer space, and yet it filled the sky. If I looked up, I would see its eye. Or eyes, if it had anything that it would recognize as such. My neck shivered as I held my head down, but I would have to look up in a moment, for I could feel the face or whatever was up there leaning closer, reaching down for me. If I hadn't broken through my suffocating panic, I would have been crushed to nothing, but my teeth tore my lip and allowed me to scream. Released, I ran desperately, heedless of the quicksand. The dunes crept back from me, the squirming beach glowed, the light flickered in the rhythm of the chanting. I was spared being engulfed, and when at last I reached the dunes, or was allowed to reach them, the dark, massive presence still hovered overhead. I clambered, scrabbling up that path. My sobbing gasp filled my mouth with sand. My wild flight was from nothing I'd seen. I was fleeing the knowledge, deep-rooted and undeniable, that what I perceived blotting out the sky was nothing but an acceptable metaphor. Appalling though the presence was, it was only my mind's version of what was there, a way of letting me glimpse it without going mad at once. I have not seen Neil since. At least, not in a form that anyone would recognize. Next day, after a night during which I drank all the liquor I could find to douse my appalled thoughts and insights, I discovered that I couldn't leave. I pretended to myself that I was going to the beach to search for Neil, but the movement so began at once. The pattern stirred. As I gazed, dully entranced, I felt something grow less dormant in my head, as though my skull had turned into a shell. Perhaps I stood engrossed by the beach for hours. Movement distracted me, the skimming of a wind-blown patch of sand. As I glanced at it, I saw that it resembled a giant mask, its features ragged and crumbling, though its eye and mouth couldn't keep their shape. It kept trying to resemble Neil's face, though it seemed to look furry and purple somehow. As it slithered whispering toward me, I fled toward the path, moaning. That night he came into the bungalow. I had not dared to go to bed. I dozed in a chair, and I frequently woke trembling. Was I awake when I saw his huge face squirming and transforming as it crawled out of the wall? Certainly I could hear his words, though his voice was inhuman chorus I'd experienced on the beach. Worse, when I opened my eyes to glimpse what might have been only a shadow, not a large, unstable form, fading back into the substance of the wall for a few seconds, I could still hear that voice. Each night, once the face had sunk into the wall as into quicksand, the voice remained longer, and each night, struggling to break loose from the prison of my chair, I understood more of its revelations. I tried to believe all this was my imagination, and so, in a sense, it was. The glimpses of Neil were nothing more than acceptable metaphors of what Neil had become, for what I was becoming. My mind refused to perceive the truth more directly, yet I was possessed by a temptation vertiginous and sickening to learn what that truth might be. For a while I struggled. I couldn't leave, but perhaps I could write. When I found that, however bitterly I thought I could think of nothing but the beach, I wrote this. I hoped that writing about it might release me, but of course, the more one thinks of the beach, the stronger its hold becomes. Now I spend most of my time on the beach. It's taken me months to write this. Sometimes I see people staring at me, not winking, not blinking, staring at me from the bungalows. Do they wonder what I'm doing? They will find out when that time comes, won't they? Everyone will. Neil must have satisfied it for a while. For the moment, it is slower. But that means little. Its time is not like ours. Each day the pattern is clearer. My pacing helps. Once you've glimpsed the pattern, you must go back to read it over and over. I can feel it growing in my mind. The sense of expectancy is overwhelming. Of course, that sense was never mine. It was the hunger of the beach. My time is near. The large, moist prints that surrounded mine are more pronounced. The prints of what I am becoming. Its substance is everywhere, stealthy and insidious. Today, as I looked at the bungalows, I saw them change. They grew like fossils of themselves. They looked like dreams of the beach, and that is what they will become. The voice is always with me now. Sometimes the congealing haze seems to mouth at me. At twilight, the dunes edge forward to guard the beach. When the beach is dimmest, I see other figures pacing out the pattern. Only those whom the beach has touched would see them. Their outlines are unstable. Some look more like coral than flesh. The quicksands make us trace the pattern, and he stoops to depths from beyond the sky to watch. The sea feeds me. Often now I have what may be a dream. I glimpse what Neil has become, and how that is merely a fragment of the imprint which it will use to return to our world. Each time I come closer, recalling that insight when I awake. As my mind changes, it tries to prepare me for the end. Soon I shall be what Neil is. I tremble uncontrollably. I feel deathly sick. My mind struggles desperately not to know. Yet in a way I am resigned. After all, even if I managed to flee the beach, I could never escape the growth. I have understood enough to know that it would absorb me in time when it becomes the world. Voice of the Beach by Ramsey Campbell.